In any near-future space opera or science fiction movie, it is essentially taken for granted that mankind will colonize the solar system, although for over half a century, nobody seems to have worked up the necessary motivation and financial commitment to make anything like this happen. And the reasons for that are pretty obvious. It's difficult to justify spending billions or perhaps even trillions of dollars on something that has very questionable benefits. I mean, Mars may be an interesting place, but we don't know what it has in regards to crucial resources or anything else that could really benefit an investor in the near future. So why establish a colony on the red planet? Why invest so much taxpayer money or private investor money in such a risky undertaking? Well, as most of us know, Elon Musk has his reasons, and they sound pretty compelling, at least on the surface. At some point in the future, although we're looking at about 1 billion years in the future, the sun is going to undergo a very dramatic change. Not a sudden change, it's going to take millions of years for this to happen, but the sun will grow hotter and hotter as it continues to run out of fuel and begin to consume helium instead of hydrogen, and when that happens, Earth is going to get cooked to a cinder. It will become an uninhabitable planet, and if we don't have a permanent presence established on another planet like Mars by then, the human species will become extinct. We're talking about 1 billion years in the future, nearly 20 times as long as the amount of time that has elapsed from the extinction of the dinosaurs until now. Can we think perhaps of something a little bit more pressing, something that's going to happen in the near future as opposed to so far in the future that it's difficult to comprehend? I mean, mankind is going to be evolved into a completely different species by then. Who knows what's going to happen between now and 1 billion years AD? Well, yes, indeed. And so in this episode, we are going to share the top 5 reasons that Mars should be colonized, and therefore the top 5 reasons that Elon should really be talking about instead of what's going to happen to the sun in the distant future. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that we've discussed a number of times in the past on this channel, but frankly, it's been quite a while. As we all know, Elon, in spite of his various distractions, continues to talk about Mars, and now he's actually giving us what he thinks might be a realistic date for at least an unmanned mission to Mars in 2026, although honestly I think he'll be lucky if we can get Starship to Mars by 2028, given where Starship is now in its development. All of that having been said, though, the idea that he has behind it, or the justification for mankind colonizing Mars as opposed to just visiting Mars or setting up some kind of part-time scientific outpost on the planet, is very, very far in the future. We're talking around 1 billion years or so from now. The sun will have changed, will have heated up to a degree to where this planet will no longer be habitable. And so that is the justification that he continues to talk about over and over again. A justification that's very difficult to relate to. 1 billion years from now, and man, as far as what we are now from an evolutionary standpoint, have only been around for a couple 100,000 years. We're talking thousands of times longer than mankind's entire history on this planet. Why really should we be all that concerned about something that far off in the future? And I happen to agree with that. I think that this is the last thing that Elon should be talking about, because there are far more pressing dangers to human civilization that could happen tomorrow. Things that we really should be paying a lot closer attention to, and things that a second human presence, assuming that it's a robust human presence on another planet, could save us from. That is to say, preserve human civilization and preserve the human species even through the worst of cataclysms. So right now, we're going to start with the top 5 reasons that we should be colonizing Mars. And first of all, we're going to get started with probably the most obvious one, the possibility of an asteroid, or more dangerously, a cometary impact on our planet and what that could do to us. So I've talked extensively about asteroid impacts, especially asteroids like Apophis on this channel, but what I haven't talked as much about is cometary impacts, both of which are quite dangerous, but comets are especially dangerous because they travel far faster than asteroids, and by the time we know they're there, oftentimes it's going to be too late to deflect them. So let's have a look at a relatively modest comet. Let's check that scenario with a comet 1 mile or about 1.5 kilometers in diameter and what that impact would look like on our planet. Let's go ahead and set up the point of impact in the middle of Vermont, not exactly the most populated region of the United States, so maybe kaboom! Well, the crater is pretty huge to start off with, 13 miles in diameter, but not too many people getting killed by a 466 gigaton explosion. But then again, when we look at the fireball, the true scope of the devastation becomes very, very apparent. We're talking almost all of New England and every major city in the Northeast being utterly annihilated. Between the people killed immediately and those who receive third-degree burns, who will almost certainly die within 24 hours, we're looking at 17.5 million dead, 12.5 million receiving second-degree burns, clothing catching on fire within 159 miles of impact. Now the trees catching on fire, that's when things get really, really devastating. We're talking about an area of devastation over 500 miles in diameter. That's 128 million acres, or more than twice the size of the largest wildfire in human history. A fire that almost certainly could never be put out and would have to take a massive snowstorm of some kind to make it go away. But don't worry, that's something that would definitely happen. Now you're looking at the pressure wave. The area of devastation and death caused by this is equally horrific. Another 250,000 people killed, and anyone within 121 miles would be permanently deafened. And of course, we have this huge region of buildings collapsing, and now you're looking at the windstorm. And this would be in excess of anything experienced in human history. Over 5 million people killed by the wind. In other words, pretty much everybody spared by the fireball, and the wind within 63 miles of the blast being faster than storms on Jupiter. Supersonic winds, the sort of thing that simply hasn't been experienced on this planet, at least not in human history, and anything within 183 miles of the blast feeling like being inside an EF5 tornado. It is difficult to comprehend this level of devastation. And then finally, you have the earthquake, over an 8-pointer on the Richter scale. This, of course, killing at least some people, those who are still alive, 15,733 or so. The earthquake being felt all over the Northeast. And this, as they say, is only the beginning. Also, billions of tons of debris would be thrown up into the upper atmosphere, burning cities, and the soot from all of that devastation would make this even worse, creating an ice age the likes of which our planet has not seen for tens of thousands of years. It would probably only last a few decades, but in that time, especially given the fact that the sun would be utterly blotted out for a couple of years, the vast majority of plant and animal life would either go extinct or at least suffer severe depopulation. And, of course, the starvation experienced by the human population would be utterly cataclysmic as well. Human civilization would disintegrate. I can't imagine how order could be maintained when food supplies would be essentially non-existent in the aftermath of a cataclysm like this. Civilization and the human species itself would teeter on the brink. And although our species might survive, it would take centuries, if not millennia, for us to recover. And keep in mind, this is a relatively small comet. If we're talking about a comet, say, the size of Halley's Comet, the level of devastation would be hundreds of times worse. "536 CE was a very, very bad time to be a human being. Not only had the Western Roman Empire fallen, not only were barbarian hordes ranging up and down what is today Europe, and not only was the Eastern Roman Empire replacement, which we know today as Byzantium, really struggling to try to maintain any sense of order, especially with all the diseases that were making life really entertaining for 6th century humans. But then, in 536, something else happened. A series of natural disasters that made this perhaps the worst year in human history to be alive. One chronicler who was unlucky enough to be alive at this time was Roman statesman Cassiodorus, and he wrote the following, quote, "Men are alarmed, and naturally alarmed, at the extraordinary signs in the heavens, and ask with anxious hearts what events these may portend. The sun, first of stars, seems to have lost its wonted light, and appears of a bluish color. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, to feel the mighty vigor of his heat waste into feebleness. The moon, too, even when her orb is fueled, is empty of her natural splendor." Although he could not have known it, Cassiodorus was witnessing the phenomenon that happens in the aftermath of a devastating volcanic eruption. Not quite a super eruption, but bad enough to cause a drastic climate change to our planet. Temperatures plummeted by several degrees in the northern hemisphere, and agriculture collapsed in the aftermath of this explosion. Scholars believe that the eruptions of 536 CE may have been linked to the start of the late antique Little Ice Age, which persisted for a decade or even longer in the northern hemisphere. All of this is small potatoes compared to the devastation that would be created by a super eruption. Let's have a look at how widespread the cataclysm might be with a Yellowstone super eruption. By the way, Yellowstone is not the only place where a super eruption is possible on our planet. It's just the most famous. It took decades for geologists to figure out the scope of Yellowstone super eruptions because they kept looking for a volcanic caldera or remnant of a volcanic mountain and could find nothing. That's simply because they weren't looking on the right level of scale. It turned out that the last time Yellowstone experienced a super eruption, the caldera consumed almost half of the park. We're talking about not a volcanic mountain, but a volcanic crater, hundreds of square miles in size. It is utterly enormous. Once again, something that utterly defies our understanding in the modern age. The last time there was a super eruption of this caldera 631,000 years ago, the human species was almost completely wiped out. And the reason this happened is the same reason that would cause devastation in the aftermath of a cometary impact. The last time Yellowstone erupted in a super eruption anyway, it released so much ash and smoke and debris into the upper atmosphere, it practically blotted out the sun, once again creating a short-term ice age. And by short-term, we're talking about something that lasted around a century or so. a deep freeze that is difficult for us to even understand in our modern age, and something we are very fortunate hasn't happened during the time of civilized man. Because if something like this were to transpire, well, the impact to the United States alone would be nothing short of horrifying. It would dump so much ash across the western and central United States that it would poison virtually all of the U.S.'s available farmland. And with that, it would take years, if not decades, to make the land fertile again. Granted, volcanic ash eventually makes very rich, very productive soil, but that takes a very long time. And in the meantime, the soil produces virtually nothing at all, which means U.S. crops would utterly fail. And the U.S. would be utterly dependent on its neighbors and allies for food support during the time of this ice age. But unfortunately, because the ash would blot out the sun for the rest of the planet, everybody else would be in a state of horrible crisis as well. Virtually every weather event that creates our food supply cycle would break down. And once again, I don't see how governmental infrastructure and human civilization would survive a cataclysm of this magnitude. There would be too many mouths to feed, not enough food to sustain them, and too many frightened, desperate people for any government to control. Once again, our species might survive, but it would probably set us back decades, if not centuries. Now, another potential cataclysm that's worth talking about, something that once again could really threaten our civilization, or at least set us back significantly, something we see every day. That's the sun. Sure, we know about solar flares and sunspots and the small-scale inconveniences that they cause depending on how many satellites they disrupt, but a much more serious solar flare, something called a coronal mass ejection, or rather, the mother of all coronal mass ejections, could make things very, very inconvenient for our civilization. Indeed, it could send at least half the planet back to the Middle Ages in the space of seconds. In August 1859, astronomers around the world watched with fascination as the number of sunspots on the solar disk grew to an unprecedented level. Among these astronomers was Richard Carrington, an amateur sky watcher in a small town called Redhill near London, England. On September 1st, as Carrington was sketching the sunspots, he was blinded by a sudden flash of light. Carrington described it as a white light flare. Apparently, it lasted about 5 minutes. The flare was a major coronal mass ejection, also known as a CME, a burst of magnetized plasma from the sun's upper atmosphere. In 17.6 hours, the CME traversed over 150 million kilometers between the sun and the Earth and unleashed its force on our planet. It usually takes multiple days for this event to reach the Earth, but this got here a lot quicker. The day after Carrington observed the impressive flare, our planet experienced an unprecedented geomagnetic storm, with telegraph systems shorting out and going haywire, and auroral displays normally confined to polar latitudes visible in the tropics. Carrington put two and two together and realized that the solar flare he'd seen was almost certainly the cause of this massive geomagnetic disturbance. This was a connection that had never been previously made. The solar storm of 1859 is now known as the Carrington event. Around the world, there were reports of sparks showering from telegraph machines, operators receiving electric shocks, and papers set ablaze by the rogue sparks as our primitive and relatively undeveloped electrical system was utterly destroyed. When telegraph workers returned to work the next day, the effects of the Carrington event were still being felt as the atmosphere was still very charged. The American Telegraph Company employees found it impossible to transmit or receive dispatches. Alarmingly, they found that they could, however, unplug their batteries and transmit messages to Portland using only the auroral current. If a similar event were to hit today, it would cause an internet apocalypse, sending large numbers of people and businesses offline and shorting out transformers worldwide. Researchers from Lloyd's of London and the Atmospheric and Environmental Research Agency have estimated that a Carrington-class event today would result in between $0.6 and $2.6 trillion to our electrical infrastructure in the U.S. alone. And to make matters worse, there's not nearly enough replacement transformers and replacement infrastructure to repair this kind of damage. That being the case, as much as half of the electric grid of the entire planet would utterly fail, followed by a breakdown in infrastructure, food supply, transportation, and other critical things to human survival. And again, the same sort of chaos that comes in the aftermath of a cometary impact or supervolcano eruption would certainly happen in the aftermath of an event like this as well. And the big problem is, these sorts of things, like the Carrington event, probably happen a lot more often than supervolcanoes and asteroid impacts. We've just never noticed because we've only recently become reliant on electricity. And now, of course, that we've discussed all of these really horrible natural disasters that could threaten our civilization or perhaps destroy them, it's time to talk about something man-made. And no, I'm not talking about global warming. In my opinion, global warming is something we're probably going to be able to fumble through and eventually survive, even though it's going to make things pretty unpleasant in the future. It's not something that, in my opinion, is going to threaten human civilization, at least not in the near future. But of course, the most obvious human-caused cataclysm, the one that we've been living in the shadow of for many decades now, is, of course, nuclear war. A chilling book called Nuclear War: A Scenario came out just last year and makes very clear just how dangerous and threatening the prospect of nuclear conflict still is, in spite of the decades of disarmament between the United States and Russia. In this book, the war begins with North Korea launching a surprise ICBM towards Washington, D.C., shortly followed by a second surprise nuclear missile launched from a North Korean submarine towards the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in California. The United States fails to stop both warheads, they hit their respective targets, and the United States decides to retaliate against North Korea. But in order to counterattack quickly enough, the United States nuclear arsenal needs to fly over the North Pole and therefore over Russian airspace. At the time of sending missiles over Russian airspace, Russia is not yet a target. The U.S. desperately tries to contact Russian leadership to notify them that their end target is North Korea and not Russia. However, Russia interprets the ICBMs flying over their airspace as an attack on Russia and decides to launch over 900 nuclear warheads of its own towards the U.S. The U.S., of course, responds to this, launching the rest of their stockpile on Russia, along with NATO allies launching all of their nuclear weapons at mostly Russian targets as well, wiping out hundreds of millions of people and obviously later plunging the planet into nuclear winter. Essentially, the consequences of this type of cataclysm would be similar to a cometary impact or a supervolcano, except you would have a lot more radiation and a lot more burning cities, which would put a lot more soot and smoke into the upper atmosphere, perhaps even worsening the nuclear winter to a greater extent. It seems that when it comes right down to it, when you compare the consequences of natural disasters to the sorts of disasters that we can create, there's no contest. Humans are probably going to be the best at wiping out their own civilization. But now that we've discussed all of the horrible justifications for colonizing Mars, perhaps we should talk about something positive. A justifiable and logical, rational reason that we should actually establish a colony on another planet. I mean, sure, preserving the human species is a very, very good thing to do, but what about something that could actually make all of us rich? Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the benefits of asteroid mining. Suffice it to say that there's more wealth in a single asteroid known as 16 Psyche in the asteroid belt than there is in the entire economy of our planet. Lots and lots of extremely valuable resources are available out in space, not very difficult to get to, assuming you can escape from Earth's gravity. And that is the biggest problem. It requires so much fuel to escape from Earth's gravitational pull that by the time you've done that, you've consumed about 97% of the total mass of your rocket, which means you don't have a whole lot left to go out mining asteroids. However, a Mars colony could overcome a lot of those problems. Number one, because it's closer to the asteroid belt, but number two, because it has only 1/3 the gravitational pull of the Earth. That being the case, then, asteroid expeditions could be dispatched from Mars to the asteroid belt with far less fuel, far less delta V, and with much bigger profit margins for asteroid mining companies. So a Mars colony is probably the best and most effective way to exploit the resources of space, and if you can do those sorts of things up in space where there is no ecosystem, no environment, no climate to destroy, we can support the needs of our resource-hungry civilization without destroying the planet we live on in the process. This is something that Jeff Bezos has always believed very strongly in, hence the term Blue Origin. He wants the Earth to be a blue, pristine planet for us to live on while we export all of the damaging things that humanity does, from mining to heavy industry, out into space. And this would be an interesting way to combine both the vision of Elon and the vision of Jeff Bezos into one single mission that could benefit humanity for centuries to come. So there you have it, the top 5 reasons that we should colonize Mars. 5 justifications that are far, far more pressing, things that could happen very much in the near future, and indeed one thing that could enrich our entire economy and civilization. All of these things are near future possibilities, not something that's going to happen a billion years in the future. But of course, the question remains, what sort of help could a Martian colony offer the rest of human civilization? Sure, maybe it would allow a small nucleus of human survivors, or perhaps as many as 1 million, to survive into the long term, but is that really how we want to survive, with 99.9% of the human population annihilated? Well, when it comes right down to it, a Martian colony could save human civilization as well as preserving this small nucleus that we were just talking about. There is so much water, trillions and trillions of tons of water on Mars, and with all of that water, there's potential to grow enormous crops, enormous supplies of food that dwarf the needs of the actual colonists, meaning that if there was some sort of natural cataclysm that disrupted the food supply on Earth, it is theoretically possible for a Martian colony to make food drops to Earth to provide additional support for a struggling, devastated human civilization. And so that, perhaps, is the most crucial reason that we should establish a human presence on Mars. It doesn't necessarily need to be an escape valve, but rather an emergency support network for our Earthling brothers should they ever get into serious trouble. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also please consider supporting this channel on Patreon or Cash App. All the details are in the description. Thanks again for watching, and as always, stay angry about space.